Welcome back to another edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. Putting value in your career. In this segment, I want to talk about one of the most important aspects of life, career, choosing your career, how to choose your career, and really why career is important. The reason that I focus on career is because career is really the foundation of your life in many different ways. Career obviously determines the amount of money that you can make, and clearly if you feel more confident in your abilities in your career, in the work that you do, that's going to generally translate to greater promotions, greater advancement in one way, shape, or form. And that doesn't necessarily mean career in terms of working for someone else. It could mean very easily working for yourself, or it could mean a combination of those things. Now, what I found in many social settings is that many people, particularly throughout school or any of the career training programs, they really don't talk about some of the fundamentals that are important in choosing a career and why career is so very important. Number one, they don't ever talk about the importance of you as a variable in that equation of a career, because you are the most important aspect of your career. Obviously, it is you who is going to be the person that is going to put the effort, the talent, the ability into that career. Obviously, you're going to be doing things, engaging in tasks and activities, engaging and interacting with people. So the effectiveness that you have in any of those areas in your career obviously is going to have a very strong impact on your advancement, your potential for advancement. Now, it's not only dependent upon you when you're talking about a career, because obviously, particularly if you're working for someone else, you're going to interact with other people. And of course, you'll have bosses, no matter what your position is, no matter how high up, even if you're in the board of directors, you have shareholders and other people that you have to answer to. So no matter what your position is in a particular organization, you're going to have to answer to someone, and that person that you answer to and the other people that you engage with are going to have a direct bearing on your potential for advancement as well. So it's not just your abilities in your respective career. And I want to highlight that because, number one, that is very rarely, if ever, discussed in many career training programs and many career training activities, seminars, school. Most of the time, they don't describe and discuss those very important and practical aspects of building your career. That's one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, because it's a practical method of self-training. It's really helping you to develop yourself, of course, but also to develop yourself in a way that is going to allow you to be able to solve various problems in your life and deal with the vicissitudes of life, the things that come and go in life, in a way that is going to give you a certain level of inner strength and a balanced self-trust, which is what I call the 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability. In this segment, of course, I'm talking and focusing on individuality. Career is an important aspect of your individuality, because if you are successful in your career, now keep in mind when I say successful, I mean something very specific. I mean, really, you are able to produce more desirable results in your life than undesirable results. I would define that as a measure of success. Now, people define success differently, and that's another reason I developed the Shinsei method: to define your individual terms, act on those terms, analyze those terms, reevaluate those terms, and then repeat that process of training. That becomes the process of training, but it also becomes the process of you. And really getting yourself into the mindset and to the ability of that practice, that habit, that repetition of activity is really what the Shinsei method is all about, and it's really what training is all about. So getting yourself to the mindset of understanding the importance of you when you're talking about a career is one of the most important steps. And understanding something about yourself is going to help choose your choice of career. Another thing that is very rarely discussed in many training programs or careering programs or seminars or school programs in career. I remember when I was in college, career placement really, and I went to one of the top 20 schools in the country. Not that that matters per se, but I just wanted to highlight that I didn't go to some podunk school somewhere that no one has heard of, just in the off chance that you think that's the reason that this existed. This was a standard in the school that I went to. And it's a standard throughout the country, unfortunately. And it really amounted to nothing more than a dartboard where you walked in and threw a dart on the wall and you took wherever the dart landed. That is not the best or the most effective way to establish your career. Now, of course, I'm being a little facetious, but not completely. It wasn't exactly a dartboard. They didn't have a dartboard that I recall in the placement center, but it amounted to the same thing, because what you had is you had a series of companies. They determined everything. All the companies determined their schedule, who they would see, when they would come, what they were looking for, and the students really determined very little. And they also determined the quality of positions, which generally tended to be quite low. And you would go into the placement center, and I did this many times. You go into the placement center, and they had people that they considered themselves to be counselors, but they didn't really help much. I tried it all. This is, again, one of the most important reasons that I've developed the Shinsei method, because of life experiences. So I tried it all. I went there, I talked to counselors, but they didn't really help very much. I went through the process of doing computer programs to find out what was suitable to me. And again, it wasn't really suitable to me. It really wasn't until I sat down myself, quite frankly, much later, because what happened is I started during a career path that wasn't really very effective for me. I chose a job to pay the bills, and it's not a bad thing to do. But once you do that, once you make that kind of decision out of necessity, it gets you locked in a particular career path, career trajectory that becomes very difficult to get yourself out of. That's what I wanted to highlight in this segment of the show, the importance of career and career choice. But before you talk about the kind of career you're going to pursue, it's important to understand something about yourself. And that's the thing that they don't spend very much time in many of these placement training programs, my college included. But that's the most important aspect of the equation. I like to go back to equations because I happen to like mathematics, and I think that it's very instructive. Again, that's the life principle method. That's what I call the Shinsei difference or the Shinsei advantage. It's using the insights from various areas of life to apply to other areas of life with the ultimate goal, of course, insight, but also development, so that you can make more effective decisions for yourself because you understand yourself all the more. And I wanted to highlight that in this segment of the show because really it comes back to independence. A career gives you a certain level of independence. If you are effective at your career, and again, understanding what effectiveness means for you, being able to do what you're doing in a way that's, again, going to produce more desirable results and less desirable results for yourself, defining that for yourself, acting on that definition, then reevaluating it and making adjustments if you need to, that again becomes the mindset, that becomes the principle, that becomes the way of Shinsei. And it really, I use Shinsei as a reference, as a compass, as a way to help you to navigate through these decisions that you have to make, in this case, career, just because it makes it a little easier. But it's a process, really. Whether you call it Shinsei or not is not as important as going through that process of learning something about yourself, analyzing your key terms, defining those terms in an individually suitable way, acting on those terms, then reevaluating that for yourself. And then that becomes the process of self-awareness, really, over a period of time. That becomes your process of training. And through that process of training, of course, you come to a greater realization about what you like, what you do, what you want to do. And of course, that can translate to a better or more effective choice in your career. But it really comes back to you. It's starting with you. And that's the place that many career placement training programs don't do. They don't spend any time at all, hardly any, in thinking about what your views are, what your values are, what your policies are, your practices. What do you like to do? What are your activities? What do you find yourself doing when you have free time? What do you tend to gravitate toward generally? What would you like to do if you had your choice and you didn't have other responsibilities or pressures on you? Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to drop everything and do that. Sometimes you have to make hardcore decisions. I mentioned one of the decisions that I had to make very early in life because of the other decisions that I made that were not appropriate for me. Again, one of the most important reasons I developed the Shinsei method from life experience. I made some decisions earlier in life in terms of marriage, in terms of career, that then served as a very weak foundation, an inner weakness really, not an inner strength. And then that really snowballed, that becomes that process, they became the process of me, unfortunately, and it became very difficult to change as you go along. So I'm speaking from experience, and I'm speaking with the value of experience and age. And this is one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, because I found that career is one of the most important choices that you can make in your life. Choosing an important career, choosing one that you get some kind of satisfaction out of, and understanding what that means in practical terms. Now, that doesn't mean that you may not choose a career or a job temporarily to do something else. That's perfectly acceptable, perfectly legitimate. You might find with a temporary job that it turns into a long-term job and then provides a satisfaction to you. But you'll learn that by going through that process of analysis over a period of time. And again, that's not something that tends to be highlighted in many social settings. So again, that brings me back to one of the second points for this segment of the show. The reason that it's important to establish self-trust, inner balance, inner strength, and why I call them the 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability. Profitability you can kind of understand in terms of career. Now, when I say profit and profitability, I'm not talking about profit and profitability strictly in financial or money terms. That's an important component of it. But when I say profit and profitability, I'm talking about what's of benefit to you. And you can't evaluate what's of benefit to you if you don't understand anything about yourself. So understanding something about yourself then becomes one of the most important and priorities you can have in life, ultimately, when you are thinking about career. And in fact, when you're thinking about career, it's not starting with career, it's starting with you. Thinking about what your policies, practices, procedures are, what your political persuasions are. That's one of the things that I recently learned, fairly recently, how important it is to choose a career that's politically aligned with your own views. And it's important to be realistic and truthful about that. Now, that's something that's never described and discussed. But if you tend to be a person who's more conservative in your viewpoints, and you go into a company, which there are many of them these days, that tend to be more liberal or left-leaning, you're going to have a lot of difficulties in that particular environment unless you're able to align with people who are more in line with you, or you have some kind of lifeline or connection with people who are in the important positions to make a decision about your career, like someone higher up. Now, if you don't have that, you may have a difficult time of it. Does that mean you can't make it work? No, it doesn't. But there are certain choices that have to be made in that consideration. Maybe you won't get as much satisfaction as you could if you were in a different position that may pay less, may pay more, depends. But that was more politically aligned with you. Now, I don't want this to be a show, and I will never allow this to be a show that I talk about the political ramifications of the political aspects. It's not a political show. But it is important to understand something about the political implications about what you do and where you go, because that has a direct bearing on your quality of life and whether or not you'll, in quotes, fit in. Because unfortunately in America, that really is what it mostly boils down to, where you fit in. How successful you are. When I say successful, I mean how much you're able to be promoted, what kind of raises you get, what kind of satisfaction you achieve from your position, what's your interaction with the people that you work with, your co-workers and colleagues. All of that has a direct bearing on whether or not you fit in. Very often in America, the emphasis is placed on whether or not you fit in versus competence. That's another thing that's important to take into consideration when you're thinking about career, because it will have a direct bearing on the choices that you make, how satisfied you are. Are you willing to forego the fact that maybe you may be overly competent or overly qualified for a position, or underqualified for it, but you fit in well, so you get promoted? Are you satisfied with that? Now, mostly I am directing this show and what I talk about at the ShinseiMethod.com toward people who would not normally be satisfied with that approach. Because the whole purpose of the Shinsei method is to develop value and meaning in life and develop yourself in a way that is satisfactory to yourself and that gives you some sense of fulfillment and understanding what all those terms mean: fulfillment, satisfactory or satisfaction, personal satisfaction, personal joy, invigoration, being able to create and produce. These kinds of things are very important when you're talking about a career and the individual tasks that you'll be tasked to do in a particular career. Do you like it? That's what it really boils down to. And the answers to many of these kind of personal questions will have a direct bearing on whether or not you like that position. And ultimately, that's what it boils down to when you're thinking about the kind of career that's important to you. But the thing that I wanted to focus on this segment of the show is starting with you as the point of departure for how you analyze what's appropriate to you in terms of a career versus starting with the career. Thinking about what's important to you, what you do well, and going through that process and getting to a point where you feel confident about that. That's what I mean by self-trust. Trusting that this process that you've gone through is producing something for you, that's giving you some realization about what's of value to you in a career in your productive capacity. Now, so self-trust is also very important because this approach tends not to be very popular in many social settings. You may even find a lot of hostility. If you tell people what you're trying to do, they'll look at you like you're crazy. I know, I've experienced that. Well, that's a not too subtle way of discouraging you from pursuing this enlightenment, this path of enlightenment that I strongly urge you to pursue in your own life. Now, sometimes from a strictly survival perspective, you may not even want to tell people that that's what you're doing. You just leave it as an individual strategy for yourself, and then you go ahead and make the decisions in your life based upon what you have determined on your own. I have found that to be the most effective way for me. Because very often in many social settings, this approach, as rational as it might be, as much as you can provide data to people to show you that this is a very important way of approaching a career so that you're better at your career, you're more competent, and why competence is an important value. Very often in many social settings, that's not the case. People don't seem to give a lot of value to competence. Now, that does not mean that competence is not valid and valuable. It still is. It always will remain so. It's a natural principle. You want to verify that for yourself. Look at the animal life, animal kingdom. They don't have to live in a social setting, except they don't live in a human society, I mean. And they have to be competent. The difference with an animal is that if it's a wild animal, they have to be competent or they die. There's a much stronger motivation for them to be competent at finding food, at raising their young, at teaching their young effective principles and effective activities and effective tasks in doing those same things over and over again, and dealing with the weather and navigating through unknown terrain and protecting themselves and defending against harm and threats, etc. Those are all really... They're all motivated in animals by nature. Humans don't have that kind of motivation unless they live on the streets, and unfortunately there's a lot of people who are doing that. Most people, though, are not in those extreme conditions. They have the cushion of society where they can go to a grocery store and get food for themselves, and they don't have to go out and hunt for it and then cook it and then create shelters for themselves and those kinds of things. They don't have to live in the elements. So that means that the motivation has to come from within. And that's why it's so very important. And unfortunately, though, it allows a lot of people to ignore the importance of things like competence and value and skill and knowledge. That doesn't mean that they're not valid and valuable. They are valid and valuable. And in some settings, mostly I would advance that, or I would suggest, mostly in smaller businesses, you'll find that will be rewarded. In the larger businesses, it becomes a reflection of the society at large. And the larger the business is, the more people can hide behind the competence and skill level of other people or other people who have come before them. and it becomes more of a political game, unfortunately. Well, if you're an individual for whom that is satisfactory, you'll probably do well in those environments. But if you're like me and you don't like those kind of environments and you instead like competence and you want to develop competence like a scientist would, like an investor would, then really a different strategy is called for. And that's one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method. But that doesn't mean just because the social environment is such that valid or value or competence don't seem to be valid and valuable, they don't get the rewards, they don't get the compensation schemes, or they don't get the promotions, it seems. The least competent seems to get the most promotions, for example. And they're more inclined to get promoted based on how they look, how they sound, who they know, and all of the other superficial things that tend to be much more important than competence. Ultimately, competence has to be valid and valuable in any setting. Unfortunately, what I've found is that you just have a few people who tend to be competent, and then other people ride on that competence to the extent that they can. Now, teams don't work that way. The best teams don't work that way, and then you'd have a coach that doesn't allow those teams to work that way. But in many work in corporate settings, unfortunately, it does work that way, and you have very little choice in the matter, and you have to decide for yourself if that's going to be important to you, or if you would like to pursue a different avenue, like working for yourself or having some kind of combination of the two. Now, in this day, in this era, where more and more people are working from home, it opens up more opportunities for people to do that. So this is a great opportunity to think about whether or not that's more suitable to you and go through this process of self-analysis to determine what's right and what's suitable to you. And when I say what's right, I mean what is suitable to you. And I'm not talking about what's suitable to you to the exclusion of everyone else. I'm not talking about self-centeredness. What I'm talking about is balance. Because that's another thing that I've found in many social settings. People often throw around a lot of very noble terms like duty, obligation, and right, wrong, these kinds of things. And what you find is a lot of people who tend to be more truth-oriented, like I was, will follow along. Because it's important to be moral to the extent that you can in your own life, to do what's right, to not injure others and seek to not injure others. That's very valid and valuable. But then you turn around and see that a lot of people, even people that you know, even people in your own family perhaps, I've experienced this, don't seem to care much about that. Well, that puts an undue pressure on you and communicates the message to you that these kind of views, duty, right, obligation, are meaningless in society. Because if to the extent that you try to pursue them, you're the one that gets penalized. Well, that's an understandable conclusion to draw. I drew it, but it's really not a rational conclusion to draw. Just because things exist in society or in a social setting doesn't make them right. Doesn't make them so, doesn't make them logical. And many times, to the extent that they're popular and social, they're very irrational. And that realization is a very important realization, but it's not an easy realization to make. Again, that's one of the reasons that I developed the Shinsei method as a method of self-training to get you to a point where you can make that realization for yourself and live it. And then you have the self-trust over a period of time by validating for yourself in your own life, through reality, through facts, through experience, that this way that you have established for yourself makes sense for you. It works because you see the results. The results are desirable. And this really allows you to build up a level of self-trust over a period of time. But it does take time. And it's much more difficult to get it started than to continue it, particularly if you establish it earlier on. Because once you establish this approach and you establish a career that's suitable to you, you have a certain amount of financial ability, it becomes a lot easier for you to then make certain choices in your life. And that's really what it comes down to ultimately. Independence. Making decisions, standing by those decisions, and being able to stand by those decisions. And the consideration of money has a lot to do with it. If you choose a career wisely, going through this process of self-analysis is what I mean by wisely, earlier on, it allows you to establish a career over a period of time that you enjoy and that brings you financial as well as emotional and psychological rewards. You're able to determine what community you live in, what kind of home you can buy, and then that really then becomes the ability to be able to choose the kind of people you interact with and whether or not those people are supportive of your approach or not. If you're in a situation like I have been for many years, where you're living in a neighborhood where, because of financial decisions to minimize your costs, this is why I've chosen this, but because of the choices in career I've made, I've not been able to live where I may have wanted to live with other kinds of people that I feel more comfortable with, that look more like me in a sense. I'm not talking about from a physical point of view, but I'm just talking about they're clean, they take care of themselves, they exercise, those kinds of things. And that depends a lot on where you live. If you live in an apartment, many of the people that live in an apartment don't do those things. They have very irregular lifestyles. A lot of them have bad credit, and you can tell by the way that they behave. They come and they go. They don't seem to have any productive activities. They're coming and leaving and coming and back multiple times during the day. You never see them doing laundry. You never see them doing grocery shopping, these kinds of things. All of these things that I do on a regular basis. Well, if you're living in that kind of environment, it also, again, sends the message that your views and your values are not relevant to society because you haven't been able to establish yourself. That's the important lesson to learn. That if you start with this approach earlier in your life and you establish yourself in a way that is suitable to yourself, you can establish a career that is based upon your own inner values, your own inner sense of being in a way, your views, your values, your policies, your practices, your procedures, your politics, if you will. And once you do that over a period of time, then you can establish, build a certain level of wealth externally as well as internally. This idea of wealth building is a very important concept. And I'll take that up in another segment of the show, because wealth doesn't just mean money wealth. It means inner wealth. Now, this is well understood. People talk about it a lot, but unfortunately, like a lot of things that are very wise and that have a lot of insight, they become nothing more than platitudes. Well, I'm not referring to this in terms of platitudes. I mean wealth in all of the senses. And this is what the Shinsei method really strives to address. Inner strength, inner balance, self-trust, that's inner wealth. So building that up earlier on allows you to be able to make certain choices in your life that really allow you then to stand by those decisions, those choices, because you feel good about those choices. And that has residual effects. It has a circular and constructive effect over the period of your life. Now, the opposite is true. If you make certain decisions that are not appropriate to you, that has a cyclical effect as well. And that's unfortunately what I've learned, and I've had to strive and struggle with great difficulty to break that cycle, which is what I've done with the Shinsei method. I begin to break that cycle. But it came at a very important personal cost to me. A lot of years where I felt very uncomfortable about my social settings, and I'm still not 100% satisfied with it, but at least I've begun that process of building it. And that's really why I developed the Shinsei method and extend that insight to you, because I feel that it's very, very important to allow you to establish a career, a way of operating, a way of living, a way of existing, a way of emoting, a way of thinking, a way of being that is satisfactory to you, and that ultimately you can choose where you live, with whom you interact, and those people can reinforce these important values, and that just makes it all the more much easier to then develop a level of inner strength, inner balance, self-trust. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.